The obsession with going faster is a built-in feature of being human. From cars to planes to horses to sports to fictional spaceships.
If it's a fast ship.
Fast ship. You've never heard of the Millennium Falcon?
We're always trying to squeeze out just a little more speed. The same also applies to computers, whether they're from the 1980s and 90s or today. In today's Atari ST 101 video, we're going to talk about accelerators in the Atari ST. Let's get to it. Back in the day, the Atari ST was no stranger to accelerators. There were multiple designs, manufacturers, and features provided by the different upgrades. And while they were heavily advertised, it seemed like, in the different magazines of the time, I'm not sure how commonly they were actually used in the world. Of the about 100 Atari STs that I've worked on over the years, I've come across one that already had an accelerator installed in it. Sadly, my 520 ST did not have an accelerator installed. I didn't even know they existed at the time, so didn't even know what I was missing out on until recent times. So what are accelerators? Different accelerators vary in design, but they're all there to perform the same basic function, to get one of these computers to run software faster. Now, in the case of Atari STs, this is accomplished by, in most instances, actually I think in all instances, by swapping the existing 8 MHz 68,000 CPU with a faster 68,000 CPU or a newer CPU like a Motorola 68030, or both a faster and a newer one, meaning a 68030 running faster, say 50 megahertz, 40 megahertz, etc. Many early Atari ST accelerators simply used the same CPU or a higher binned version of the Motorola 68000, just simply clocked at 16 megahertz rather than the 8 megahertz. That's standard on the board. Now, later versions of accelerators, in the early 90s in particular, you started seeing 68030s, Motorola 68030 CPUs, along with other features as well, that were running at significantly faster clock speeds, say 40 megahertz or even 50 megahertz. Whether they were early accelerators or later accelerators, other features were also added to these accelerators to differentiate the different products from each other. They are things like an FPU coprocessor that was intended to help with floating point calculations, or cache memory, enhanced ROMs, or even a blitter chip in some instances. Actually, the one that I have has a blitter chip and an FPU and a 60 megahertz clocked CPU. Modern accelerators today, they follow a very similar pattern, right? But somewhat expanded. Instead of there's 68,000 CPUs that all run at 16 megahertz. There are also 68,000 CPUs that run at, say, 40 megahertz, 48 megahertz, 50 megahertz, is significantly faster. And then you also have the newer CPUs like the 68030s. In the Atari STs, I don't think I've ever seen anything like a 68040 or 060 or anything like that. Those are reserved for things like the Falcon and the various different Amigas. But they're at varying different speeds. In addition to that, rather than having cache RAM or a blitter chip or an FPU in many instances, what you'll find on these more modern accelerators are things like an IDE connector to provide an internal hard drive capability, or the ability to flash different ROMs onto them, or what we call alt RAM. It's oftentimes also referred to as TT RAM or even fast RAM if you're coming from the Amiga community. Think of it as a similar kind of a structure there. Why might someone want an accelerator? Well, I think to fulfill the intended purpose of an accelerator, to run software faster, maybe in the case of games with a smoother, cleaner frame rate, for added features, like I mentioned earlier, so the internal IDE connector for an internal hard drive, or maybe you want to have the ROM switching capability, or whatever that may be, or maybe you just want to see faster numbers on GemBench, right, in benchmarking software, just because you can. The reason why I like to use accelerators or work with accelerators is because I like to tinker with my computers and see the power of these Atari STs and what was available back in the late 80s, early 90s, if you really wanted to push these computers to the limit. So how do these accelerators work? Well, in the Atari ST and really in any computer in general, these accelerators work by replacing this original CPU with one that can process instructions faster through higher clock speed, as we talked about earlier, or through more advanced and efficient instruction sets, or a combination of both. Now, while processing instructions at the CPU faster can improve the overall performance of the computer, it somewhat becomes bottlenecked at a certain point by other functions that are going on in the computer because it's limited. The CPU, graphics, and DMA on the Atari ST in particular all use the ST-RAM and are limited in the following two ways. First, the ST-RAM runs at the standard 8 MHz bus speed. And even if the CPU is running at 50 MHz, it doesn't change how quickly that ST-RAM can be written to or read from. Now second, in addition to the slower speed of that ST-RAM versus the CPU, it's also shared with the CPU, with the DMA, and the graphics chip as well. And so when DMA instructions or graphics instructions are being run, the CPU can't have access to that RAM. Now, these issues were resolved by some early accelerators and also the Mega STE by adding a small amount of cache RAM dedicated to the CPU, often as little as just 16 kilobytes. This would remove a large part of the bottleneck, enabling the CPU to perform functions at full speed with that cache RAM acting as a buffer, right? So that cache RAM could be dedicated to the CPU, could be used only by the CPU to perform the various different functions. And then when the CPU would then assert back and get access to the ST-RAM, it could then flush out those results to the ST-RAM and pass those instructions on further, thus providing a significant performance boost. Now, in later ST accelerators and many modern ones, this cache memory was either replaced or even supplemented or even replaced with alt-RAM, referred to alt-RAM, TT-RAM, or fast-RAM. I'm going to use the term alt-RAM going forward so I don't have to say alt-RAM, TT-RAM, fast-RAM over and over and over again. The alt-RAM acts in a way very, very similar to that of the cache RAM of the Mega STE, but there's a whole heck of a lot more of that RAM. This RAM is directly tied to the CPU, just like the cache RAM is, and it can be run not only at much faster speeds, but at the wider, especially if you're looking at a 6830, a wider 32-bit bus, rather than the 16-bit bus of this ST-RAM. In this side-by-side comparison, we're running the exact same accelerator card in this computer. Only in one situation, we're running it with the alt-RAM, and in the other, we're running it without the alt-RAM. And you can clearly see the difference in the performance and capability. If you get rid of the alt-RAM, you're almost to a stock ST performance in many ways. It is a little faster, but you don't get nearly the speed boost that you otherwise would get. So what kind of speed improvement could you expect? And the answer, as it is with a lot of these things, is it depends. Some software will not run an alt-RAM, and because of that, it's not going to benefit from that ability to eliminate the bottleneck. Some software has hard-coded timings, and some software runs in a way that running faster is really not even noticeable. So for programs that run an alt-RAM, the speed improvements can be astounding. You're talking 3, 4, 5x in some instances, what it would normally run on an unaccelerated ST, or even faster potentially. The recently released ST Doom, it launches and loads on a base Atari ST. You can see the screen, you can even kind of move, but you really can't play it. On an accelerated Atari ST with a 6830 running at 50 megahertz, the frame rate is slow by today's standards, but in my mind it's playable. As a general rule of thumb that I've experienced is that the later software can often use both the alt-RAM as well as a faster CPU and CPU instruction sets. And my guess, and it is a guess, is that these programs were coded after the introduction of the Atari TT, which had both the faster 6830 CPU with the new instruction sets, as well as alt-RAM. In that case, it was called TT-RAM originally. Additionally, there will be compatibility issues. It's not a question of if they exist, but more of if you will run into those compatibility issues on the software that you like to run on your computer. From my testing and just kind of testing a lot of different software on accelerators as well as hard drive adapted games, these are games that typically run from a floppy disk but have been adapted to run from a hard disk. Those tend to have a lot more compatibility issues just because they're coded to run on specific hardware with specific conditions and looking for those specific conditions. And if they're not met, or find something weird or different, like a 6830 accelerator, it doesn't like it. Now, what does it take to install one of these accelerators? Well, it depends on two major things. First off, the accelerator, and secondly, the computer you're installing into. Let's start with the easiest. The easiest are the Atari STEs. Not the Mega STE, but the STEs. And in those, the 1040 STE and the 520 STE, that is. And the reason that is the case is that a large majority, not all, but a significant majority of them have a socketed CPU. It's a PLCC, so it's the square type socket, but it's a socket nonetheless. And so you don't have to worry about desoldering anything or whatnot. So what do you do there? Well, you pop out the CPU, carefully pop out the CPU, plug in the accelerator boards, in this case the Monster Turbo or Monster Turbo board, as well as the STE 536. Those two both simply are really pretty much plug and play. There's a couple other things and a little bit of instructions here and there, but no soldering is required. Again, with a socketed CPU in that case. Additionally, you do also have to remove the ROMs because the accelerators require either a modified ROM or at least ROM 2.06 in order to support the extra functionality that it has. So what about the other STs, right? The 520 ST, the 1040 STF, the 520 STF, STFM, etc., etc. Well, with those, you have a soldered-in CPU. I've refurbished a large number of these computers in the past. Everyone that has that package of CPU, the rectangular package, the two rows of pin package, those are all soldered to the boards. So the first step you have to take is you have to desolder that CPU from the board and then add a socket. And with that socket, then you can insert whatever accelerator card you need. And I think for the most part, you're there. You also have to take care of the ROMs. It's a similar situation. However, in those cases, with those, you could say older STs, you may have to have some sort of a decoder that decodes TOS 2.06 or whatnot. That might be required as well. In many instances, those are actually included with the accelerator cards, but not always. In addition to adding a socket for the CPU, you also have to check to make sure that there's room for the accelerator card in the board that you're installing it into. The 520 ST, the original short case with no internal PSU, no internal floppy drive, that style of Atari ST in general has a good amount of room inside of it for an accelerator card by the CPU where it's located. Additionally, the Mega ST, plenty of room. No worries at all. You can probably fit anything in there. All right. It's a big pizza box. There's a lot of room for it. However, when you start looking at the 520 STFs, those with the internal floppy, internal PSU, 1040 STFs, the CPU is located in a number of different spots on the board. And I'm kind of cycling through a few images of different motherboards and different configurations. Depending upon where that CPU is located, in most instances, installing an accelerator card right on top of that, putting a socket in, you're going to probably run into problems. That said, what you can do is you can utilize something that the Amiga community utilizes pretty regularly with the Amiga 500, are CPU relocators, PCBs. There are a number that are already out there that are used for Amigas. You may be able to design your own for an Atari STF, but you'll have to do something in most instances. So the final question is, should you install an accelerator in your Atari ST? Well, that is for you to decide for yourself. However, I'd like to pose a few questions and answer them for yourself how you will. First, do you enjoy tinkering with your vintage computers? Second, if you don't have an STE that's got a socketed CPU, are you comfortable with desoldering your CPU, or do you have a friend that would be comfortable with desoldering the CPU and adding a socket? 3, are you okay with that the accelerator, with the accelerator installed, you may not be able to run all software associated with the Atari ST? And then lastly, because these accelerators are really, they're hobbyist passion projects at the end of the day. They're not these big commercial companies that are doing this, right? And so are you willing to troubleshoot issues you may have with the community? Because the creators of these cards, these accelerator cards, everyone's computer is 35, 40 years old, right? And with a 35, 40-year-old computer, that pedigree may vary significantly from computer to computer. Capacitor situations, power supply, all sorts of different things. So you're going to probably need to be comfortable with troubleshooting. So if you answered yes to most of these questions, an accelerator card might be a good thing for you to do. Now, I hope you all enjoyed watching this Atari ST 101 video on accelerator cards and the Atari ST. Please do the YouTube things, like, subscribe. It'll help out this channel to continue to grow. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you being here. Take care. Bye.